On May 22nd, 1945, as a cold rain fell like needles across northern Germany, a group of British soldiers stopped a few men walking quietly near Bremerwörde. The war had ended 2 weeks earlier, but the country still felt like a storm had passed through it, and the roads were filled with refugees, deserters, and people trying to disappear in the chaos. To the sergeant in charge, these men looked like any other defeated Germans in worn uniforms and tired faces. But one man stood out, like a dark stain on a white page. He wore an eye patch, and his nervous energy seemed to float around him like thin smoke. His papers looked strange, and the soldiers became suspicious. Later, during a routine oral check, the medical officer saw his teeth and realized that the man was Heinrich Himmler. A few minutes later, everything changed. The soldiers realized they had captured Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and the overseer of the camps that had murdered millions. Himmler was taken to Lüneburg. The next day, during a medical exam, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule, ending his life in minutes. The man who once terrified Europe was buried in an unmarked grave, its location kept forever secret. No trial, no punishment, no justice. But his death was not a final chapter. It was only the beginning of another story. For his wife, Margarete, and his 15-year-old daughter, Gudrun, who was close to turning 16, the war was far from over. About a week before Himmler was captured, American troops stopped Margarete, and Gudrun were moved through several Allied camps in the Austria-Italy region and were later held in camps inside Germany. They were sent through Allied internment camps, where questions never seemed to end. What did they know? What had they seen? What secrets might they carry? Inside the crowded internment rooms, they faced long interviews. They did not face trial, but they did not know how long the questions would continue or what the Allies wanted to learn from them. The fall of the Third Reich had come fast and hard, like a tall tower collapsing into dust. Cities that once held glowing Nazi parades now lay silent and broken. German soldiers surrendered from every direction. During this chaos, Himmler, one of the most feared men in Europe, tried to escape by pretending to be a sergeant of the secret field police. But Allied patrols checked every road, and his disguise fell apart quickly. If he had lived, he might have stood in the courtroom at Nuremberg, but the cyanide capsule closed that door forever. Some later reports claimed that he might have carried another cyanide capsule, but this was never confirmed by the British officers who were present. Meanwhile, Margarete and Gudrun were fleeing southern Germany. We can imagine Margarete held her daughter's hand tightly as they moved through the quiet and uncertain roads of southern Germany, not knowing what they would face next, while Gudrun, still only 16, might have believed her father would somehow find them. But war does not answer hope. And when American soldiers stopped them near Bolzano, their story began to move in a darker, more uncertain direction, one full of fear, secrets, and consequences they never expected. In the months after their capture near Bolzano, Margarete and Gudrun were moved between Allied internment camps in Italy, France, and Germany. Different intelligence agencies wanted to question them as new information about Himmler's network slowly appeared through documents and other prisoners. Interrogations came again and again. American and British intelligence officers questioned them many times, and the questions mainly focused on Himmler's network and any documents he might have left behind. They searched for hidden knowledge. Where had Himmler kept his papers? Did he plan resistance groups? Did he leave behind names, accounts, or safe houses? Margarete gave them very little. She sat straight, hands folded, showing quiet dignity even as she lived on a narrow cot and wore plain camp clothes. When officers asked about her husband's work, she answered carefully, "I knew nothing of his political work. I lived a simple life." She painted herself as a traditional German housewife, far from the violence her husband had built. But the MI5 and British intelligence reports said that she supported Nazi ideas and had appeared at several party events, smiling and comfortable among high-ranking guests. Reports described her as loyal, reserved, and bitter over her treatment. Some reports described her as bitter and unhappy about her situation, but there is no evidence that she saw herself as a victim. Whether she truly believed her story or used it as a shield remains debated. The evidence shows she knew more than she admitted, but the Allies had no proof of direct crimes. Without that, they had limited grounds to prosecute her. Gudrun, however, was different. At 16, she showed open defiance. She repeated her father's innocence with fierce certainty. "My father was a great man," she might have said. She rejected every photograph, document, or testimony about the camps, calling them lies meant to destroy Germany. Many interrogators had seen the camps with their own eyes, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and others. They had walked through the gates and faced the dead and dying. They tried to make Gudrun understand, but she refused. Accepting the truth might have destroyed her idea of who her father was, so she built a wall around her beliefs. "I will never believe he did anything wrong," she told one officer. Those words would guide the rest of her life. Their detention overlapped with the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945. For the first time, leaders of a defeated nation were judged before the world for crimes against humanity. Films from liberated camps were shown, and survivors testified. Documents bearing Himmler's signature were entered as evidence. But Himmler himself was gone, his suicide closing the door on any explanation he might have offered. They were questioned by Allied intelligence during the period of the Nuremberg trials, but they were not considered official witnesses for the court, hoping for insight into Himmler's private world. Neither woman faced charges. There was no proof they had committed crimes or planned resistance. When the trials ended in late 1946, the Allies reached a final decision. Margarete and Gudrun were released, but the country they returned to was shattered. Their home was confiscated. Their accounts were frozen. Cities around them lay in ruins. And everywhere they went, the name Himmler followed them like a shadow, one that would never fade. Margarete and Gudrun settled in the Munich area, finding modest apartments in a city still struggling to emerge from devastation. The grand lifestyle they had once known, the fine house, servants, and certainty of privilege, was gone. They lived on small payments, temporary jobs, and help from people who still felt loyal to the old SS networks, and occasional support from acquaintances who had served under Heinrich Himmler and still felt private loyalty to his memory. Germany at the time was undergoing its own reckoning. Allied authorities created denazification tribunals to classify former Nazis, dividing them into 5 categories with different consequences. Millions filled out long questionnaires while neighbors testified about neighbors, and the line between justice and resentment often blurred. Margarete was first classified as a Mitläuferin, or follower, in the late 1940s, during the early denazification process, a follower, one of the mildest judgments. But as captured records were examined, investigators found her involvement in Nazi welfare groups and letters showing ideological support for Hitler and her husband. Her wartime diaries revealed admiration for the regime and the privileges she had enjoyed. Her case was reviewed again in the early 1950s, and investigators questioned her deeper involvement in Nazi organizations, which caused her denazification process to last longer than most, an activist or profiteer. She faced certain penalties, including limits on her civic rights, and she protested these decisions strongly and temporarily lost voting rights and pension benefits. Humiliated, she protested the decision, insisting she had been only a wife and mother. Gudrun, now in her 20s, tried to build a normal life. She worked as a dressmaker and later a secretary, sometimes using different surnames. In 1951, she married Wolf-Dieter Berwitz in 1951. He later became involved in far-right circles in West Germany, and they eventually had 2 children. Yet her beliefs did not change. "I will never believe he did anything wrong," she said about her father. In 1952, she began reconnecting with former SS families who held private gatherings where people could speak openly about the past. These meetings offered a sense of belonging to individuals who still felt loyal to the old regime, and for Gudrun, they provided a place where her name was respected rather than feared. The 1950s brought economic recovery to West Germany, and many citizens tried to look forward instead of backward. But for Margarete and Gudrun, the past remained inescapable. The Himmler name ensured they could never fully blend into the new society. Publicly, they appeared like any other family rebuilding after the war. Privately, they clung to memories and loyalties most Germans wished to forget. By the early 1960s, Gudrun Berwitz had settled into what appeared to be a conventional life. She lived with her husband and children in a modest home near Munich, attending to domestic duties, perhaps seen by neighbors as an ordinary German mother. To her neighbors, she probably looked like an ordinary German mother who lived quietly with her husband and children in a suburb near Munich. But this outward normalcy concealed a continued commitment to defending her father's memory, and, by extension, the ideology he had served. During this period, something remarkable and disturbing occurred. Gudrun found employment with the Bundesnachrichtendienst, West Germany's intelligence service, commonly known as the BND. Between 1961 and 1963, she worked as a secretary at the BND's headquarters in Pullach, a suburb south of Munich. She used a different surname to obscure her identity, and for years her employment there remained unknown to the public. It was only decades later, after her death, that the BND acknowledged in official statements that it had employed Heinrich Himmler's daughter during the Cold War years. This revelation, when it finally emerged, sent shockwaves through Germany. How could the intelligence agency of a democratic state have hired the daughter of the SS chief? Some historians suggest her employment symbolizes how deeply former Nazi networks had penetrated post-war West German institutions. In the rush to establish a functioning intelligence apparatus to counter Soviet espionage, pragmatism often trumped moral considerations. Some commentators suggest that her family background and personal contacts may have helped her get a secretarial job, and that the post was seen as low risk, so the checks were not very strict. After leaving the BND in 1963, Gudrun became increasingly active in veterans and revisionist circles. During the 1950s and 1960s, former SS members and their families had begun forming mutual aid networks, organizations ostensibly dedicated to helping Germans convicted by Allied tribunals. The most prominent of these was Stille Hilfe für Kriegsgefangene und Internierte, Silent Help for Prisoners of War and Interned Persons, officially founded in 1951. On its surface, Stille Hilfe presented itself as a humanitarian charity, providing support for imprisoned Germans and their families. In practice, however, it became a haven for unrepentant Nazis and a funding mechanism for legal defenses and welfare support for convicted war criminals. The organization operated in legal grey areas, carefully staying within the boundaries of what was permitted while serving morally reprehensible ends. By the 1970s, Gudrun had become one of Stille Hilfe's most visible figures. She attended reunions of former SS officers, gatherings where elderly men in civilian clothes shared memories of their service, speaking in careful language about campaigns and battles. She wrote letters to imprisoned war criminals, sending them encouragement and assuring them they had not been forgotten. She helped raise funds for their legal appeals and for support of their families. We can imagine her at these events, perhaps a woman in middle age by then, grey beginning to show in her hair, but still carrying herself with the conviction that had defined her since childhood. She might have listened to aging SS veterans tell stories about the Eastern Front, or about comrades who had fallen, and she might have seen in these men not war criminals, but patriots who had served their country. The organization channeled resources to some of the most notorious figures of the Nazi era. Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon, who had tortured and murdered French resistance members and deported Jewish children to Auschwitz, received support from Stille Hilfe's network. So did Anton Maloth, convicted of murdering prisoners at the Theresienstadt concentration camp. These were not men whose guilt was ambiguous or whose crimes had been exaggerated. They had been tried and convicted based on substantial evidence. Yet Gudrun saw her work as righteous. In the few interviews she gave to friendly writers, she described her father as a great man who had been misunderstood and said that he had done good things for Germany. She accused Allied historians of distorting the past, of creating a false narrative about the war and the concentration camps. She insisted that much of what was said about her father and the SS was exaggeration or fabrication. For decades, she mostly avoided mainstream journalists and very rarely allowed herself to be filmed. But occasionally, photographs would emerge from private gatherings, images of an elderly woman, composed and dignified, smiling among former SS veterans. To those who saw these photos, they were chilling symbols of post-war denial, evidence that the ideology of the Third Reich had survived in some hearts, even as Germany built a democratic society. German authorities were aware of her activities and those of Stille Hilfe. The organization drew quiet concern, but as long as it operated within legal boundaries, not explicitly calling for violence or the overthrow of the government, there was little authorities could do. It was not illegal to write letters to prisoners, to raise money for legal defenses, to hold private beliefs about history, no matter how repugnant those beliefs might be. And so Gudrun continued, year after year, decade after decade. The world around her changed dramatically. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Germany reunified. The Soviet Union collapsed. A new generation grew up with no personal memory of the war, for whom the Third Reich was ancient history. Holocaust education became mandatory in schools. Memorials were built to remember the victims. Germany as a nation undertook a remarkable process of confronting its past, of ensuring the crimes of the Nazi era would never be forgotten. But through all these changes, Gudrun Berwitz remained constant. She attended meetings, maintained her connections, and never wavered in her defense of her father. She never expressed remorse, never acknowledged that what the SS had done was wrong, never admitted that her father bore responsibility for the murder of millions. When she died in Munich on May 24, 2018, at the age of 88, she was still regarded by some as the symbolic daughter of the SS. Her death was reported in the mainstream press, but it drew special attention in certain far-right circles, where she was mourned as a kind of hero, and as someone who had kept faith when others had turned away. Her life had spanned from the height of Nazi power through the Cold War, through reunification, into the 21st century. She had outlived the regime by more than 70 years, and for most of that time she kept defending her father's image and what she believed he had stood for. It was a lifetime of loyalty to a memory, of refusal to accept what the evidence so clearly showed, of dedication to a father she loved, but whom history would forever condemn. While Gudrun Berwitz spent her life defending her father's memory, other branches of the Himmler family made very different choices. Heinrich's brothers, Gebhard and Ernst Hermann, each faced their own reckoning, though their stories were quieter than Gudrun's long fight to protect the past. Gebhard Himmler was briefly held for investigation in 1945, like many Germans who had been connected to Nazi organizations. After his case was reviewed, he was classified as a Mitläufer in 1948 and allowed to return to civilian work. His denazification file remained open for several years, and in 1948 he received the classification of Mitläufer. This decision allowed him to rebuild his life. He settled in Munich, worked in local industry, and even represented a German cultural office that cooperated with Afghanistan. It was modest, respectable work, the kind of life many Germans tried to build after the war. He chose silence, avoiding interviews, and refusing to speak about Heinrich. When he died in 1982, he left behind a quiet life, untouched by the loud battles over memory that defined Gudrun's later years. Ernst Hermann Himmler, the youngest brother, never faced such judgment. Before the war ended, he worked in journalism and radio, supporting Nazi propaganda. He joined the Volkssturm during the final defense of Berlin. On May 2, 1945, in the last chaotic fighting, he was killed. He was killed on May 2, 1945, during the last battles in Berlin. What happened to his body is uncertain, as many casualties from those days were never recovered. He never answered for his beliefs. History closed over him without a trial. The contrast among the brothers is clear. Gebhard stepped back from public life. Ernst died before anyone could question him, but Gudrun chose open and active defense, insisting until her death that her father had been treated unfairly. Decades later, a new voice appeared with a very different approach. Katrin Himmler, born in 1967, grew up in a West Germany still marked by the war. As Heinrich Himmler's great niece, she carried a name she had not asked for. As a child, she likely learned to watch people's reactions when they heard it, feeling the weight of history long before she understood it. As she studied political science and history, she decided she would not run from the name. She would confront it. In 2005, she published The Himmler Brothers, a German family history, a deeply researched book that examined the lives of Heinrich, Gebhard, and Ernst. Writing it required reading documents that described the full scale of her great-uncle's crimes. She wanted understanding, not excuses. "My goal was not to cleanse the name, but to understand it," she said. Her work humanized the brothers without forgiving them. She showed how ordinary people were shaped by nationalism, ambition, and the culture of early 20th century Germany. She faced the past honestly, choosing truth instead of denial. She took part in educational events and public discussions, where she sometimes met people whose families had suffered under the Nazi regime. These meetings were painful but necessary, showing how inherited history shapes different lives. Her courage gained international respect. She could have changed her name and hidden, but she chose openness. The contrast between Gudrun and Katrin is sharp. Both women carried the same name, yet they chose opposite paths. Gudrun defended the SS and denied the Holocaust. Katrin acknowledged the truth and worked to educate others. They represented two Germanys, one unable to let go of denial, and one committed to honest memory. Their choices show that a heavy legacy does not decide a person's future. Each generation must choose denial or acknowledgement, silence or truth. In 2014, nearly 70 years after Heinrich Himmler's death, historians presented a large collection of his private papers that had long been kept in a private archive in Israel, and these letters and notes were then prepared for publication and exhibition. For decades, scholars had reconstructed Himmler's role in the Holocaust, primarily through official documents, orders bearing his signature, reports from concentration camp commandants, and organizational charts of the SS apparatus. These records painted a picture of systematic murder organized with bureaucratic efficiency. But the personal papers offered something different, a glimpse into the private thoughts of a man who had orchestrated genocide. What emerged from these documents was perhaps more disturbing than if they had revealed a raving madman. The letters and diaries showed someone deeply concerned with mundane domestic matters, writing tenderly to his wife and daughter about household affairs, inquiring about Gudrun's schoolwork and piano lessons, worrying about family finances. We can imagine the jarring contrast as historians read through these papers. The letters show that Himmler often wrote about Gudrun's schoolwork and small family matters, and at the same time, his signature appeared on official papers that ordered transports to Auschwitz and approved special actions in other camps. He fretted about the cost of household repairs while overseeing an industrial apparatus of murder. He sent loving messages to Puppe, his little doll, while implementing the final solution. He complained about bureaucratic inefficiencies in his work that included the systematic killing of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. For many historians, these papers illustrated what philosopher Hannah Arendt had termed the banality of evil. Arendt coined this phrase while covering the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the Holocaust's chief organizers. She observed that Eichmann was not a monster in any conventional sense. He was a bureaucrat, someone who spoke in administrative jargon about logistics and efficiency while organizing mass deportations to death camps. Himmler's personal documents offered similar evidence. If his letters had been filled with expressions of sadistic pleasure or ideological ravings, we might have been able to categorize him as psychologically aberrant, fundamentally different from ordinary people. But instead, the documents revealed someone who seemed disturbingly normal in his personal life. A man who loved his daughter, worried about money, and attended to domestic details while simultaneously overseeing crimes of unprecedented scale. This ordinariness might be the most frightening aspect of the discovery. Evil, these documents suggested, does not always announce itself dramatically. It does not always wear a monster's face or speak in obviously twisted language. Sometimes it appears in bureaucratic memos, in careful organizational planning, in someone who sees themselves as a dutiful servant carrying out necessary tasks. Perhaps Himmler genuinely believed he was serving Germany, fulfilling an unpleasant but essential duty. Perhaps he compartmentalized so completely that he could write loving letters in the evening after spending his day managing genocide and never experience cognitive dissonance. The human mind's capacity for self-deception and rationalization is nearly limitless, particularly when ideology provides justification. The publication of these documents added more detail to what was already known about Gudrun's close bond with her father. The letters show that Himmler wrote to her in a warm and caring way, and they underline that his affection for his daughter was real, even while he directed mass murder in his official role. For people who sympathized with Gudrun, these papers could be used as evidence that the architect of genocide also behaved like a loving father in private. Proof that the man who wrote such tender words to his daughter could not have been the monster history portrayed. But of course, this logic fails. Genuine love for one's child and participation in genocide are not mutually exclusive. History provides numerous examples of people who were kind to their families while being cruel to everyone else, who compartmentalized their lives so thoroughly that they could commit atrocities professionally and return home to domestic normalcy. Himmler's love for Gudrun did not diminish his guilt. It only made him more human, and that humanity is precisely what makes his crimes so disturbing. It reminds us that terrible evil can be committed by people who are, in other aspects of their lives, ordinary. They love their children, worry about household expenses, enjoy music and good food. And they also sign orders condemning millions to death. This realization forces uncomfortable questions. If monsters commit atrocities, we can identify and stop them by recognizing their monstrosity. But if ordinary people can commit atrocities, if the capacity for such evil exists within normal human psychology, then none of us can be entirely certain how we would behave under similar circumstances. It challenges comfortable assumptions about ourselves and about the clear line between good people and evil ones. The Himmler documents have often been used as a striking example of how people who seem ordinary in their private lives can still take part in, or organize, extraordinary evil. They raised questions Germany had been grappling with since 1945. How do you reconcile the person you knew with the crimes they committed? How do children make sense of parents who were both loving and monstrous? What does it mean that someone could write tender letters to their daughter on the same day they authorized mass murder? These are not merely historical questions. They remain relevant as long as genocide and crimes against humanity continue in the world, committed not by obvious monsters, but by people who see themselves as patriots, as servants of their nation or ideology, as men and women doing difficult but necessary work. The story of Heinrich Himmler's family is ultimately about choices. Choices made in the face of unbearable truths, choices that echo across generations, choices that reveal how people respond when confronted with the crimes of those they love. Gudrun Berwitz made her choice early and never deviated from it. Although she was questioned in 1945 as a teenager, Gudrun began openly defending her father in the 1950s, and she continued this work until her death in 2018. She attended SS reunions, raised money for imprisoned war criminals, and insisted to anyone who would listen that Heinrich Himmler had been a great man who had done good things for Germany. Perhaps love and loyalty were, for her, absolutes that could not bend even before overwhelming evidence. Perhaps she genuinely could not reconcile the father who had held her hand and called her puppy with the man who had overseen the systematic murder of millions. Rather than accept that both could be true, that her father could have been capable of both tenderness and monstrous cruelty, she chose to reject the evidence of his crimes entirely. She denied the crimes of the Holocaust for the rest of her life, although there is no record of her using specific claims about staged photographs or foreign exaggeration, that the testimony of survivors was false, that her father had been made a scapegoat for crimes he did not commit. She built a fortress around these beliefs and defended it until her final breath. Never allowing reality to penetrate, her strongest views appeared years later, not during the Allied interrogations she faced as a teenager in 1945. It was a form of denial so complete that no amount of evidence could shake it. And in that denial, she spent her entire adult life among people who shared her convictions, who reinforced her beliefs, who told her she was right to stay loyal when so many others had abandoned the old ideals. Katrin Himmler, born into a different generation, made a radically different choice. She decided not to run from her family's history, but to confront it. She studied what her great-uncle had done, examined the documents detailing his crimes, and tried to understand how an ordinary family could produce someone capable of such evil. "I cannot change the past," she said, "but I can decide how to live with it." Where Gudrun tried to change the past by denying it, Katrin accepted it and worked to ensure accurate memory. Where Gudrun defended, Katrin acknowledged. Where Gudrun stayed silent except among sympathizers, Katrin spoke publicly, participated in educational programs, and met with descendants of victims. These two paths represent more than just individual choices. They mirror Germany's own journey after World War II. For many years, the country tried to move forward without fully reckoning with its Nazi past. Former Nazis found positions in government and business. Some war criminals received light sentences or avoided prosecution, but many others were tried and punished in the years after the war. A culture of silence settled over difficult questions about what people had done during the war years. But that silence could not last forever. In the 1960s, a younger generation began demanding answers. They wanted to know what their parents and grandparents had done, why so few had resisted, how an entire society had participated in or enabled genocide. The result was a painful but necessary period of confrontation with the past that continues today. In Gudrun, we see the old Germany, the one that could not let go, that insisted the world had been unfair in its judgment, that clung to denial and revisionism. In Katrin, we see the new Germany, willing to examine its history honestly, to take responsibility for its crimes, to ensure that Holocaust victims are never forgotten and that such atrocities never happen again. The question that haunts the Himmler story is one that Katrin tried to answer in her book. How does an ordinary family produce someone capable of such monstrous evil? Heinrich Himmler was not born a monster. He grew up in a respectable middle-class household, received a good education, seemed destined for an unremarkable career. But through a combination of personal ambition, ideological conviction, and historical circumstance, he became one of the worst mass murderers in human history. Understanding how this happened, how an ordinary person can commit extraordinary evil, remains essential. It is not about excusing or minimizing what was done. It is about recognizing that under certain conditions, with certain ideologies providing justification, ordinary people can participate in genocide. Only by understanding that uncomfortable reality can we hope to prevent such crimes from happening again. The Himmler name will never be free of its burden, and perhaps that is appropriate. Some names must carry their weight so the rest of us remember what can happen when nationalism turns to fanaticism, when prejudice becomes policy, when ordinary people decide that some lives have no value. The millions who died in the Holocaust cannot speak for themselves. The burden falls to the rest of us, including those who carry the names of perpetrators, to ensure their stories are told, their suffering remembered, their deaths not in vain. Gudrun died in 2018 believing her father was a hero. Katrin Himmler lives knowing he was not, working to ensure the truth is never forgotten. In the end, these two paths from the same dark legacy represent a choice every society must make: to confront its past honestly, or to retreat into comfortable lies. Germany slowly moved toward confronting its past, especially from the 1960s onward, and this long process is now seen as an important example of national responsibility. It was not easy, and the work is not finished. But it is necessary, because evil's consequences do not end with the perpetrator's death. They ripple forward through generations, affecting people who had no part in the crimes but must live with their legacy. How those people respond, whether with denial like Gudrun or acknowledgement like Katrin, shapes not just their own lives, but the collective memory of the societies they inhabit. And so we remember. We remember the victims. We remember the perpetrators and the system they built, not to honor them, but to understand how such things happen. And we remember the choices made by those who came after, the decisions to confront or deny, to learn or forget. That is what happened to Heinrich Himmler's family after World War II. It is a story that is still being written, because the question of how we remember and what we learn from history never truly ends. If you found this story insightful and want to understand more about how ordinary Germans navigated the aftermath of the Nazi regime, watch our video, What Happened to the Hitler Youth After WW2? A deep look at how one of Hitler's most devoted organizations faced the end of the Reich and how its members struggled to rebuild their lives in a Germany that wanted to forget they had ever existed. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our stories from history. Your support helps us continue bringing these important historical narratives to light. Thanks for reading.